Hey guys, chapter 16, conquering a new continent. We're going to be conquering in terms of expansion. We'll start off with railroad expansion, look at the Homestead Act, and then look at the environmental impact as well. And we'll finish it up with what becomes known as the Indian War. So this is the Native Americans at the Great Plains. We'll look at several of the conflicts and massacres that took place between Native Americans and the U.S. government. So let's get right to it. Railroad expansion from 1870 to 1900. During the Civil War, the Union government passed the Homestead Act of 1862. The Homestead Act granted 160 acres of land to anybody who was willing to settle the Great Plains. The Great Plains cover from about the Mississippi River right around here, and they go all the way to the Rocky Mountains right around here. So all this land here in between is called the Great Plains. The following year, in 1863, the federal government also approved the building of the first transcontinental railroad. These red lines represent the railroads that were established by 1870. The first transcontinental railroad takes us from about St. Louis, Missouri to Sacramento, California. So it linked the east with the west, and we see the expansion of railroads, and that is what it means by conquering a new continent. So the railroad that made it all possible is the Transcontinental Railroad. Completed in 1869, it was built by the Union and Central Pacific Railroads. Both lines received land grants from the federal government. Once the Transcontinental Railroad was completed, the leftover land, these major companies sold to private individuals, and that's how they became really wealthy. The Transcontinental Railroad, again, linked the East and the West. Here we see a graph of the Transcontinental Railroad construction. So remember, the Transcontinental Railroad began in 1863. So right around here, and they started to lay railroad lines all across the U.S. So this is where you see the increase. By 1869, the Transcontinental was completed. Other railroads followed, and this is why you see the increase here. However, by 1872, the economy was on a decline, and by 1873, there was an economic depression that hit the United States. The following years, railroads filed for bankruptcy, and the economy took a downward spiral. Unemployment increased, and westward expansion slowed down a bit. We're going to look at a comparison here of railroads. So this map here on the left hand side is a map we saw earlier. There was one transcontinental railroad in 1870, the one that was completed in 1869. By 1890, all these red lines represent other transcontinental railroads that link the United States from east and west. The green one here was the original one. So as the country expanded west, the government began to exploit the land's resources like minerals, lumber, and other raw materials. The abuse of such resources would destroy the environment and have ecological impact disastrous for farmers, not only in the 1800s, but also during the Great Depression in the 1930s. Here again, another map that shows us the four other transcontinental railroads. So the Southern Pacific covers California all the way to New Orleans. We have the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe Railroad, sometimes only known as Santa Fe Railroad, that crosses a little bit through the Southwest. We have the Union and Central Pacific, again, the one we saw earlier. And then we have the Northern Pacific up north that, again, crosses the United States from east to west. These little maps here, I know they're a little bit hard to see, but we kind of figure out. So in 1860, we have the number of miles of railroad tracks laid was about 30,000. 30 years later, in 1890, we have 166,000 miles of railroads that were laid. As companies expanded west, people also expanded west. In 1860, in the west, we have about 4.5 million people living. And by 1890, we have about 16.7 million people that were living in the west because the railroads carry people west and materials as well. This pie graph here shows us the land that was not farmed in purple and the land that was farmed in blue. So in 1860, because there was less people, about 7% of the land was being farmed. By 1890, 20% of the land was being farmed as well. Westward expansion promoted farming, trade, and tourism. Railroads were able to travel year-round and in all weathers with limited stops. Government aid was a primary reason for railroad boom. Now, expansion was not limited to the West. The United States purchased Alaska from Russia in 1867. This is Secretary of State William Seward was able to purchase that land. And a few years earlier, in 1894, in 1854, Commodore Matthew Perry forced Japan to open its doors to trade in the Treaty of Kanagawa. The United States began to look at annexing the Philippines as well. The United States started to realize that the country's prosperity depended on trade with Asia. So the US was no longer happy with fulfilling Manifest Destiny. They started to look overseas for expansion as well. This slide here shows us kind of like the old and the new method of transportation. So the old method of transportation, we're still using horses and wagons, but railroads are quickly replacing that old method of transportation. One more time, we have the Homestead Act of 1862 that was passed by Congress in the beginning of the Civil War. The people that did move west were known as homesteaders. So homesteaders venture west in hopes of starting new in search of economic opportunity. Life west sometimes proved very difficult though. Lack of timber, which you don't see here, there is no woods, made it hard for people to build their homes. So they built their homes out of adobe, which is mud. And this is kind of what you see in this particular picture here. Crops that were growing in the Great Plains were susceptible to clouds of grasshoppers, droughts, prairie fires, and hailstorms as well. So moving west was a risky venture. Now this picture here shows us a family picture of an Anglo-Saxon family, but they were not the only ones that were moving west. African Americans, known as exodusters, also moved west. Exodusters coming from the Bible book of Exodus, where slaves moved out of Egypt. So African Americans settled west to escape the discrimination in the South and also in search of economic gain. Surviving was a family affair. All members, women and children, were required to help to sustain the farm, to tend to animals, preserve food, make their own clothing. And that's what you see here. African American family, women and children, and you see the adobe house as well in the background. But again, they were not the only ones. Immigrants from Europe were lured by railroad companies to settle west. Railroad companies established these advertisements abroad in Europe. They were promising land for the landless and home for the homeless. Notice millions of acres of land donated to the brave pioneers of the world by generous governments of America. So it was promoting people from overseas to come to the United States. Railroad companies advertised fertile soil, land, and a new life. And it worked. A lot of people from Europe came to the US in search of these riches. So here we have several of these advertisements. On the left-hand side here, the advertisement reads, if you want a farm or home, the best thing in the West is the Atchison, Topeka, and railroad land in southwest Kansas. So right in the middle, you see the railroad. On the left-hand side, you see the prairie before settlement. And on the bottom, you see the prairies after settlement. On the right-hand side, top right-hand side, you see the woodlands before settlement. Trees everywhere, one log cabin. After settlement, the trees are gone, and that's part of the ecological impact. But this is what the railroads promoted. So railroads would show up to these European countries. They would pay the passage of immigrants aboard a ship across the Atlantic Ocean. And on the eastern shores, these railroad lines would pick up these immigrants who would then carry them west to their final destinations. So homesteaders also settled along railroad lines so as to ship whatever product they were doing, whether it be cows, pigs, or crops, to be able to ship them with ease. Other railroads here was the Union and Central Pacific. And they were advertising Omaha here. In Nebraska, the Garden of the West, 50 million acres of grain and grazing land. So grazing is cows eating the grass that was grown on the prairies. Life for women in the West, again, was not easy. Women were pivotal for the survival of the families. They were forced to do manual labor, which you see here. This lady is carrying manure. But women were also still required to do domestic work. So while moving west represented new opportunities, it also represented new challenges, particularly for women. In Utah, realizing the vital role that women played, granted women the right to vote in 1870, becoming the second state after Wyoming to grant women suffrage. They realized the important role that women played in the West, not only for their families, but the settlement of society as well. Other responsibilities for women: pumping water, which is what you see this lady doing here in the middle, gathering wood. You see the wood here being, again, next to the railroads to be able to ship their crops pretty easily, milking cows, making butter, caring for children. So it seemed like moving west for women was an addition to the burden that they already carry. As people moved west, there was another driving force that encouraged them to move west, and that was the opportunity to strike it at rich by finding gold or silver. So natural mines were being mined, and when new spreads of gold or silver finds, hundreds of people would rush in to trying to strike it rich. The rapid development of towns became known as boom towns. Boom towns added to this mythical identity of the West, where saloons were filled with men who were drunk and brawls would follow, prostitutes and poverty laid all across the streets, and where laws were nearly non-existent. So this picture here shows us Virginia City, Nevada, which was a boom town. It was the greatest silver mine in 1859. Soon, Virginia City was lined with fancy hotels and Shakespearean theaters, along with saloons. But as soon as the gold or silver was mined, these boom towns became ghost towns, full of debris, poisoned water, decaying building, and all these natural minerals were exhausted. Mountains caved in because of the explosion and the part of mining. So again, we see the ecological effect of westward expansion. But the natural landscape or the natural environment were not the only ones who were victims to settlement. Bison became another victim of railroad settlement. These behemoths were hunted down to near extinction. By the 1800s, what remained of the buffalo was a skeleton-type herd of a majestic creature that roamed the plains for hundreds of years. And as the buffalo died off, so did Native Americans who relied on the buffalo for survival. The chart on the right-hand side shows us the population of buffalo in 1800, reaching right around 30 million buffalo in the Great Plains. By 1870, the population had drastically fallen to about 12 million. And by 1900, that population was less than that, about 1 million. So we see again the ecological impact that was taking place on the Western settlements. As the buffalo died off, cattle replaced the buffalo as the great beast of the West. So we have two maps here. For the most part, they're the same. So this is, again, the Great Plains. And notice now we have cows instead of bison. Grassland once grazed by bison were now grazed by cattle. At the conclusion of the Civil War, Texas, right around here, had a surplus of cattle because during the Civil War, nobody really ate cattle. With the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad and the addition of numerous other railroads, cattle could now be shipped anywhere in the U.S. Cowboys were hired to herd cattle north along northern trails. These red trails here, they were done by foot by cowboys. They took the cows or the cattle to cow towns like Dodge City and Abilene, Kansas. They also became symbols of the Wild West, where rugged cowboys were free to roam the land and engage in gunslinging battles with Indians. So the surplus of cattle, accessibility to railroads, and demand for beef caused what becomes known as the cattle boom. However, in 1886, winter temperatures caused a lot of the cattle to die off. The next year, in 1887, there was record heat waves that also caused the cattle to die off, and overgrazing by the cattle themselves forced these cattle to eventually die off. So the cattle boom became the cattle bust by 1887. As people started to take over the environment, there was this ecological impact caused by miners, railroads, cattle, and new industries. People began to worry that the natural landscape would soon disappear. So environmentalists and concerned citizens began to ask Congress to preserve nature's beauty. So in 1864, Congress passed or granted California 10 squares of miles of the Yosemite Valley for public good and recreation. And in 1890, Yosemite becomes a national park. However, the first national park was actually Yellowstone. In 1872, Congress set aside 2 million acres of Wyoming's Yellow Valley for the enjoyment of the people, this becoming the first national bank. And initially, the U.S. Army managed the bank, but later, the National Park Services was commissioned to care for the park. And railroads took advantage of this. They soon started to take visitors to these national parks in lures of more profit.